Drop an ancient human from 30,000 years ago into your kitchen right now. Not a lab, not behind glass, just here, standing on your floor, looking around. What actually confuses them? Probably less than you'd think. What actually terrifies them? Probably not what you'd guess either. Here's the part nobody tells you about the ancient brain. It never got an upgrade. It's running the exact same hardware it had 30,000 years ago. You're not picturing a different species reacting to your world. You're picturing yourself, dropped into a world your own brain was never actually built for. There's a real term for this in evolutionary biology. Mismatch. Not a metaphor, an actual working concept researchers use constantly. It describes a trait, a habit, a craving that made perfect sense for tens of thousands of years, suddenly dropped into an environment it was never designed for. The body never got the memo that the world changed. It's still making decisions for a world that doesn't exist anymore. Once you understand that one idea, almost everything else here follows directly from it. Start with food. For most of human history, sugar and fat were rare, valuable, and absolutely worth craving hard whenever you found them, because nobody knew when the next meal was coming. That craving kept people alive. Now put that exact same craving inside a gas station at midnight. Shelves stocked with precisely the things your brain evolved to chase, in unlimited supply for a few dollars. Food scientists even have a name for the exact sugar-salt-fat ratio engineered to hit hardest, the bliss point, tuned through repeated consumer testing until a product becomes almost impossible to stop eating. An ancient visitor wouldn't understand restraint here, because restraint was never once required of them. Scarcity built the craving. Abundance and a little food science is what quietly broke it. Then there's people, actual crowds of them. Anthropologist Dunbar's research suggests the human brain comfortably tracks meaningful relationships with somewhere around 150 people, based on typical ancient human group sizes, though later researchers argue the real number is messier than one clean figure suggests. Either way, an ancient human's entire social world, every person they'd ever meet across an entire lifetime, might fit inside one subway car. Now try explaining a city of 8 million strangers to someone whose whole species-typical experience maxes out around a couple hundred people. Not confusing because it's complicated. Confusing because their brain simply has no folder to file it in. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. You'd expect an ancient visitor to be terrified of our world. The opposite might actually be closer to true. Estimates vary and get argued over constantly, but some frequently cited figures on prehistoric violence suggest a startlingly high chance of dying violently, somewhere around 1 in 7 in certain ancient human societies. Compare that to homicide rates across much of modern Europe today, sitting around 1 or 2 people per 100,000 per year. Historians and anthropologists still fight hard over the exact numbers, and not every ancient society was equally dangerous. But even with all that uncertainty built in, most modern cities are almost certainly among the safest environments a human has ever been asked to simply survive in. Which means the ancient visitor wandering your street at 2 a.m. is, statistically, probably safer than they have ever been in their life. Their gut just has no way of knowing that, because their gut never got the update either. Light is another one. For basically all of human history, night meant dark, dark meant sleep, and that was the entire arrangement. Your circadian rhythm, the internal clock that runs your hormones and sleep cycle, evolved entirely around that one dependable fact. Then came fire, then candles, then gas lamps. Then, very recently, a bulb you can leave burning all night without even thinking about it. Each step pushed bedtime a little later and confused the body's clock a little further. An ancient visitor stepping into a fully lit house at midnight wouldn't be amazed by the light bulb itself. Their body would just quietly assume it's still daytime and start making decisions accordingly, badly. Here's one that cuts against the usual assumption. You'd think an ancient visitor would find our sitting down lifestyle completely alien. Turns out it's more complicated than that. Researchers studying the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last groups still living off the land the way ancient humans did, found they actually rest almost as many total hours a day as people in industrialized countries do. The real difference isn't how much they sit, it's how. Hadza rest happens mostly in squats and crouches, postures that keep leg muscles quietly working, even while at rest, not collapsed into a cushioned chair for hours at a stretch. Their moving hours, meanwhile, cover several times the distance and burn several times the energy of an average day here. So an ancient visitor wouldn't be shocked that you sit. They'd be puzzled by the specific chair. Some researchers think a large share of modern anxiety comes down to another mismatch entirely: status. Humans evolved paying extremely close attention to their reputation inside one small group of roughly 100 people, because losing standing in that specific group could genuinely threaten survival. Now that same wiring gets handed a phone that can broadcast your reputation to millions of total strangers, all at once, constantly. The instinct to care what the tribe thinks of you never disappeared. It just got handed a microphone the size of the entire planet. This particular mismatch shows up in some very specific, very real numbers. Researchers studying isolated groups like Papua New Guinea's Kaluli population found depression rates close to 1 in 2,000 people, compared to over 5% in industrialized countries. That is not a small gap. Something about modern life, whether it's isolation, screens, constant comparison, or some mix of all three, appears to be producing a mental health problem that barely showed up in something closer to the ancestral environment. Not everything cuts against us, though. This is where the ancient visitor would probably be the most genuinely stunned, and rightly so. Simple infections that once reliably killed people now clear up with a pill from a drugstore shelf. Childbirth, historically one of the single most dangerous events in a woman's life, is now, across most of the world, remarkably survivable. Broken bones, bad teeth, a burst appendix, routine fixes today, frequent death sentences for most of human history. An ancient visitor wouldn't just be impressed by modern medicine. They would probably assume it was magic, because from where they're standing, functionally, it basically is. It isn't only medicine and food and light, either. It's volume, in every sense. Traffic, notifications, music playing in shops that aren't even trying to sell you anything, screens glowing in every direction at once. An ancient environment had long stretches of near total quiet built into it by default. Modern environments have had to design quiet, back in, on purpose, as something closer to a luxury feature. An ancient visitor wouldn't necessarily find the noise frightening. They'd more likely find it exhausting in a way they couldn't quite explain, because their baseline for an ordinary day never included this much input arriving at once. There's also the small matter of the clock itself. For most of human history, a day wasn't 9 to 5. It was task-oriented. You worked until the work was done, guided loosely by sunrise, sunset, and season, not by a number on a wall. Historians studying the shift into factory-era Europe found that clock-based scheduling had to be actively taught to people through schools, bells, and fines for lateness, because it didn't come naturally to anyone. An ancient visitor handed a strict 9 to 5 schedule wouldn't necessarily find the work itself strange. They'd find the clock strange, this idea that the task doesn't matter nearly as much as the number it's supposed to end by. One more mismatch, and it might be the quietest one. Anthropologists studying traditional ancient-style human groups consistently find children raised with heavy involvement from people well beyond just their two parents, grandparents, aunts, older cousins, unrelated adults in camp, all sharing the actual work of keeping a child alive. Researchers call this cooperative breeding, and some evidence suggests it's a big part of what let humans raise multiple demanding children at once in the first place. Compare that to a lot of modern parenting, which often comes down to 1 or 2 adults, alone, in a private house, expected to cover what an entire camp used to share the load of. An ancient visitor watching a single exhausted parent home alone with a newborn wouldn't see independence. They'd see something closer to a crisis. It's worth pausing on what wouldn't confuse them at all, because the list is longer than you'd expect. Fire still makes sense. Tools still make sense, just sharper and more specialized. Shelter, clothing, cooking, community gathered around a shared meal, still exactly the same basic shape as their own lives, just with better materials. The confusion isn't really about technology itself. It's about scale, speed, and volume, applied to instincts that were only ever calibrated for a much smaller, slower, quieter version of all of it. So, what would ancient humans actually think of modern life? Probably not simple horror. Probably not simple wonder either. Something messier and more specific, safer than anything they'd ever experienced, sicker with a completely different category of disease, lonelier despite more people within arm's reach than they could ever have imagined, and quietly exhausted by a level of light, noise, and food available around the clock that their body has no evolved category for. None of this is really a story about ancient people at all. It's a story about you. Your body is still that same visitor, standing in your kitchen at 2 a.m., phone lit up in your hand, running software built for a world with roughly 150 people in it, and never quite enough food. The kitchen just happens to already have your name on the lease. We didn't leave the ancient brain behind when we built all this. We just built an entire modern world around it, and mostly hoped it would keep up.